Before armies marched and kingdoms fractured, the English Civil War began as a contest over authority, trust, and restraint. For years, tensions simmered between the Crown and Parliament, shaped by disputed taxation, religious division, and the belief that power flowed from God or from law. That fragile balance collapsed in January 1642 when Charles I walked into the House of Commons to arrest 5 members of Parliament. No English monarch had ever done this before. When the king left empty-handed, compromise went with him, and Britain moved one step closer to war. In this documentary, we'll trace how a decade of personal rule eroded trust, why rebellion in Scotland exposed the limits of royal authority, and how the Long Parliament transformed resistance into defiance. We'll follow the chain reaction that turned political argument into mobilization, shattered parliamentary privilege, and carried the nation from the shock of that failed arrest to the first clash at Battle of Edge Hill. Understanding this moment is essential to understanding modern Britain. The English Civil War overturned divine kingship, redefined sovereignty, and set lasting limits on power. By following its political origins and violent consequences, we see how a constitutional crisis became a revolution, and how Britain emerged after 1660 profoundly changed. The 1630s looked calm from a distance. Markets opened, courts sat, and the church calendar rolled on. Up close, the surface hissed. Parish churches argued over where to place the communion table. Landowners wrangled with officials over new fees. Coffeehouse talk turned to rumors about the king's counselors. England was orderly on paper and unsettled in practice. A kingdom where rules seemed to change without warning, and where the guardians of those rules did not agree on their own limits. Religion sharpened the divide. Puritans wanted simpler worship and stricter morals, seeing ceremony as a gateway to error. Anglicans defended set forms and bishops as anchors against chaos. Catholics stood outside the law's favor, tolerated by some neighbors and suspected by many more. Each group read the other's moves as a test. A new altar rail could feel like a step toward Rome. A minister preaching against festivals could feel like a step toward rebellion. Whispered stories traveled faster than facts, and each story carried the hint of a hidden network at work. At the center stood Charles I, dignified and reserved, convinced of sacred authority and order. He pressed for uniformity in churches and demanded revenue without asking Parliament to sit. To his supporters, this offered stability after noisy sessions and costly wars. To critics, it felt like a slide toward a crown that answered to no one. The king's style, private counsel, careful distance, reliance on prerogative courts, kept decision-making tight and public trust thin. People did not see the debates in council. They saw the orders on the ground. Parliament, even out of session, lived in memory and expectation. Its members believed they stood between the subject and arbitrary rule. They worried that if they allowed innovation in finance or worship to pass unchallenged, the habit would root and future resistance would be labeled disloyalty. Letters moved between county gentry, building a ledger of grievances to be aired when the doors finally again opened. The very pause in parliamentary life fed the sense of a dam holding back pressure. Money made every dispute sharper. Harvest swings and trade disruptions pressed households that lived close to the margin. New and revived levies, fees tied to old forest boundaries, penalties for those not taking knighthood, charges linked to maritime defense, felt targeted and clever, the kind of demands invented in offices rather than granted by consent. Towns paid through guilds and port duties. Villages paid in coin and resentment. When officials arrived with warrants, the argument was not only over cost, but over who had the right to ask. Public debate moved to pulpits and presses. Sermons set out lines of loyalty and warned against backsliding. Pamphlets probed constitutional questions and circulated through inns and shops. Gossip filled the gaps between law and rumor, turning policy into tales of plots and counterplots. This was a cold civil war, fought with words, ritual, and local acts of compliance or delay. By the end of the decade, communities had already practiced taking sides, quietly and then with more confidence. Here's the mind-bending part. England drifted toward conflict without a standing army, without a professional police force, and without a clear script stating who decided in a stalemate. Authority rested on habit, charisma, and cooperation. Once those frayed, every instruction needed explanation, and every denial sounded like defiance. The next step would test where obedience ended and where power actually began. When Parliament dissolved in 1629, the doors did not reopen for 11 years. Charles I governed through council, proclamations, and courts that answered to the crown. He preferred orderly paper trails to noisy debate, and believed that kings answered for their choices to God before any earthly body. That conviction shaped his methods. He avoided votes he could not predict. He narrowed counsel to men who shared his taste for hierarchy and uniformity. Policy moved from chambers to counties as instructions, not negotiations. To fund those instructions, the Crown leaned on revenue streams that did not require a grant from the Commons. Royal monopolies licensed trades from soap to salt. Fines revived under medieval statutes raised money by policing old boundaries and obligations. Compositions for not taking knighthood brought in more fees from substantial landholders. Wardship and the sale of forest rights added to the ledger. Every device had a legal root, but the overall effect felt like taxation without the ritual of consent. Sheriffs and justices had to collect from neighbors they might see every week, so enforcement produced friction, even when the sums were modest. Ship money became the most visible symbol of this approach. Traditionally a levy on coastal communities to equip ships in time of danger, it appeared in new writs that reached inland counties as well. The Crown argued that defense was a national duty, and the seas protected everyone. Assessors calculated quotas, local officers posted demands, appeals moved slowly. Payments arrived, but so did petitions and test cases. The debate was not about the Navy alone. It was about whether the king could turn emergency logic into a routine tool, and whether geography should no longer matter in law. At the same time, religious policy tightened. Under Archbishop William Laud, bishops pressed for uniform services, rails at altars, and stricter oversight of ministers. Church courts asked more questions about conduct. Visitations looked closely at the layout of parish spaces and the content of sermons. To some worshipers, the changes promised dignity and order. To many others, they raised fears of ceremonial drift. The sightlines of a communion table or the wording of a prayer book could set off arguments that spilled into vestry meetings and local quarrels. Because the king's authority backed these reforms, resistance sounded like disloyalty, and compliance felt like surrender. Open opposition was rare in these years, but quiet refusal grew. Landowners paid and kept notes. Merchants balanced accounts while cultivating contacts who could plead for relief. Town corporations obeyed instructions while commissioning counsel to test boundaries. Councillors in these localities sent cautious letters to Whitehall, asking for clarification in one sentence and hinting at distress in the next. Networks of kin and patronage carried news from shire to shire. Every small defeat in court or order from a bishop's office added to a running total in private. One case cut through the legal fog. A single landowner challenged ship money in the courts. Judges sustained the king's right, but the victory came at a cost. The arguments, printed and passed along, taught a wider public to frame doubts in legal terms. People learned the language of prerogative and necessity and began to measure claims against it. Collections continued, yet compliance turned brittle. The crown proved it could win on parchment. It did not prove it could win hearts in the parishes and guild halls that made instructions work. The gap between lawful power and accepted power widened quietly, year by year. Charles I tried to extend religious uniformity across his multiple kingdoms, and Scotland became the test. He backed a new prayer book and insisted on bishops who would supervise worship and discipline. Presbyterian Scotland valued kirk government through assemblies and elders, not prelates. Sermons and pamphlets warned that the new forms looked like an English import at best and a doorway to Catholic ceremony at worst. Resistance began with petitions, then surged into the National Covenant, a pledge to defend Reformed religion and reject innovations without proper consent. It set a framework that bound nobles, ministers, and towns to a shared cause. Organization followed conviction. Scottish leaders called a general assembly that condemned episcopacy and asserted the kirk's right to govern its own affairs. Local committees mustered men and supplies. Noble households provided leadership, and burghs handled money and provisions. When the king ordered obedience, the Covenanters prepared to move their case with readiness. They established magazines of grain, gathered muskets and pikes, and trained companies under experienced officers. Their command structure drew on the shared discipline from kirk sessions to regional meetings, translating civic habits into military efficiency. Across the border, the crown faced a problem of means. The king lacked parliamentary grants and tried to raise forces through levies and loans. County officials dragged their feet, muster rolls filled slowly, and arms shipments lagged. The First Bishops' War in 1639 revealed the gap. The royal army assembled late and unevenly, while the Scots advanced with cohesion. A negotiated standstill followed, but it did not resolve the underlying conflict. Bishops remained rejected in Scotland, and royal policy had no secure footing. In 1640, the contest resumed. A Covenanter army crossed into England with clear supply lines and command unity. Royal forces suffered from arrears, poor morale, and disputes among officers. Skirmishes and positions taken along the northeast coast exposed weaknesses in the king's logistics. The Scots held ground, and the king could not force a decisive recovery. Military strain turned political. With money short and credit strained, the crown faced a choice between accepting the Scots' terms or finding new revenue. Defeat carried a price beyond the battlefield. To continue the war, or negotiate from strength, the king needed funds he could not extract through existing devices. Creditors demanded signals of stability. That pressure pointed back at Westminster. Calling Parliament offered cash and legitimacy, but reopened the very forum that had challenged royal methods. The wars in Scotland thus pushed a domestic crisis into the open. A policy aimed at church uniformity had triggered a conflict that tested the machinery of royal government and the consent of subjects in two kingdoms. The ripple reached Ireland as well, where fears of religious change and shifting power blended into local tensions. 3 kingdoms now sat in a single storm system, each affecting the others. English officers took note of the Scots' discipline and learned an unwelcome lesson about the power of organized, covenant-bound politics. By late 1640, the Crown's credit ran thin, pay for troops stalled, and Scottish forces held English ground. Charles I recalled Parliament because lenders wanted guarantees, and only a grant in Westminster could steady accounts. Members arrived with long lists, not only of money needs, but of injuries from the past 11 years. They treated this summons as leverage, not ceremony, and organized committees to examine every office that had grown under royal prerogative. From the start, the Commons and Lords acted as if continuity mattered more than convenience. They pushed measures to prevent sudden dissolutions, fixed routine sessions, and framed themselves as a standing partner in government. Committees sat daily, took depositions, and mapped how revenue had been raised without their consent. The tone changed. Ministers explained themselves under scrutiny, and records from prerogative courts moved from locked chests into committee rooms. What had been royal methods became public case files. Targets emerged quickly. Monopolies that farmed out trades for cash faced investigation and repeal. Forest fines, knighthood compositions, and the machinery for ship money drew censure and cancellation. Prerogative courts such as the Star Chamber and High Commission, which had punished dissent and enforced religious policy, were abolished. The message was practical: end the tools that had allowed government without regular grants. Local officers read these acts and adjusted at once. Warrants slowed, collections paused, and parish disputes over conformity found new footing. Personal responsibility followed institutional change. Leading royal advisors were impeached, detained, or charged, accusing of bending law to supply the crown and shape the church. The act signaled that proximity to the king did not grant immunity. It warned future counselors that policy had consequences beyond dismissal. Trials and examinations drew crowds, and news sheets carried summaries to country readers. The hallway talk of Whitehall became a public affair, giving the realm a shared storyline of accountability. Statutes then locked new habits into place. No taxation without Parliament's consent, no long gaps without a session. Emergency powers trimmed and tied to law. These clauses did not solve every dispute, but they established fences that officials could see. Sheriffs, bishops, and judges now had to weigh not only royal orders, but parliamentary statutes that described the limits of those orders. The balance of fear shifted from displeasing the court to violating acts read aloud in every shire. Politics spilled outside the palace and the house. Crowds gathered at Westminster and in the city. Parish pulpits argued reform and order. Printers ran day and night to feed demand for petitions, remonstrances, and counter-arguments. Apprentices, merchants, and craftsmen marched, cheered, or jeered as news passed by word of mouth. City companies debated loans. The Common Council measured risk and resolve. In this climate, even a sermon on ceremonial practice could move a ward to draft a petition. Religious disputes deepened the rift. Reformers pressed to root out ceremony and enforce preaching. Defenders of the old forms warned of disorder and sectarian license. Bishops became focal points of anger, and proposals to limit their power stirred the House and the streets. Each concession angered one side and emboldened the other. By the close of 1641, trust had thinned to threads. Parliament feared royal force or foreign backing. The court feared a slide into mob rule masked as liberty. The long Parliament endured through civil war, a king's death, and army rule, holding its legal identity even as the nation broke into camps. By January 1642, the dispute had hardened into suspicion and contingency plans. Parliament guarded its debates and prepared ordinances to secure the militia. The court counted allies, sounded out officers, and kept coaches ready. Each side read the other's moves as preparation for coercion. Negotiations still happened, but every message now traveled with guards and every pledge came with an escape clause. The city watched both camps and judged which could protect trade, law, and worship without turning London into a garrison. The flashpoint came when the king named leading members as traitors. He said they had stirred rebellion, invited foreign sympathy, and worked to strip the crown of its lawful powers. Behind that charge sat months of pamphlets and crowds, impeachments of advisors, and talk of control over the armed forces. The list of accused concentrated the quarrel into people. It told supporters that the enemy sat across the benches and directed the agitation outside. It told Parliament that the Crown would use accusations of treason to break its leadership, rather than argue policy through votes. Then, the boundary fell. Instead of issuing writs and waiting on sheriffs, Charles moved in person toward Westminster with armed attendants. The plan was direct: seize 5 senior figures on the floor of the House of Commons and make an example that would unsettle their allies. That decision carried more than risk. It crossed the unwritten line that kept the monarch out of the Commons, so members could debate without fear of sudden pressure. The chamber expected messages delivered at the bar, not a sovereign searching the benches. Word moved faster than coaches. Friends inside the house warned the targets, and they slipped away before the royal party arrived. When the king entered, the benches held no quarry, only members staring at a breach that turned privilege into a physical barrier. The moment did not end in arrests. It ended in silence and a retreat that signaled miscalculation. The attempt produced no captives and handed Parliament a story of violated custom and courage under pressure. The failure also showed that the Crown did not control the intelligence channels inside the city. The political damage spread at once. Londoners saw armed men in the Commons and heard that the accused had escaped. Guild leaders, parish officers, and rivermen began to act as if Parliament needed protection. Crowds formed around Westminster and along the Strand. The court sensed hostility and split between those pleading for a pause and those urging departure. The city's mood made further pressure impossible. Instead of isolating opponents, the move united waverers behind the house and made the king look unsure of his reach. Trust collapsed. Members now saw physical danger as part of the job and pushed to secure legal and armed protection. The court, fearing capture or humiliation, withdrew from a capital that had turned openly toward its opponents. Within days, the royal household left London. With that departure, the Crown surrendered the main stage of politics: printing presses, city loans, and the daily theater of petitions and debate. Commands would now travel from provincial bases, and each county would test whether law ran from the court or from the Commons. The failed arrest hardened attitudes, and lines formed quickly. In counties, Lord Lieutenants gauged who could muster men, while justices took the temperature of parishes. Geography mattered. London's wealth, print shops, and guild networks tilted the capital, and much of the southeast toward Parliament. Ports on the Channel linked the cause to customs revenue and naval security. Farther out, The North and West leaned toward the crown, anchored by great estates, cathedral cities, and a preference for established order. Yet every county showed exceptions. Market towns with cloth trades might bend one way, while surrounding villages leaned another. Loyalty grew from local conditions more than national slogans. Ministers who favored preaching and stripped ceremony carried influence in some regions. Elsewhere, landed magnates with ties to court drew tenants into royalist musters. Credit networks also mattered. Merchants who relied on London's money markets judged who could keep trade moving. Farmers looked at who would protect harvests and fairs from armed requisition. The same sermon on obedience sounded different in a parish where a bishop was unpopular than in a place where a disruptive preacher had divided neighbors. Households split. Fathers pledged horses to a royal commission, while sons drilled with a parliamentary company in the next field. Town corporations voted loans by narrow margins, then watched as dissenting aldermen resigned or were pushed aside. Church wardens recorded disputes over collections for fortifications. Choice did not always follow belief. Sometimes it followed a captain who promised pay on time or a magistrate who could keep billeting away from his street. As alignments settled, communities learned how few neutral spaces remained. Both sides raised forces through familiar institutions. The king issued commissions of array and leaned on county magnates to gather trained bands and volunteers. Parliament advanced a militia ordinance and pressed lords lieutenant and deputy lieutenants to act under its authority. Local committees collected arms, powder, and coats. Some men volunteered for cavalry to avoid the long marches and poor quarters of infantry. Others took pikes because they lacked a horse or because their parish had already bought the poles and armor. Muster fields became places where law met logistics. Arguments flooded the press and the pulpit. Declarations from the court and printed propositions from Parliament set out claims of legality and safety. Parish sermons rehearsed the duty to obey and the duty to defend true religion, often within earshot of men who would march the next week. Broadsheets and newsbooks traveled with carriers from inn to inn, giving distant shires a sense that their local quarrel echoed a national one. Each side framed its case as protection of property, of conscience, of peace. Few believed a long war was coming. Leaders expected a show of force to bring talks back on their terms. Recruits thought in months, not years. That expectation affected planning. Magazines held weeks of grain, not seasons. Officers used personal credit to advance pay against hoped-for levies or loans. When skirmishes began, reality adjusted those timetables, but not at once. England found itself with two sets of orders and two treasuries vying for the same barns and bridges. Some towns tried to stand aside. They issued neutrality statements or swore to admit neither garrison. It rarely held. Passing units took supplies, rival captains enforced loyalty oaths, and neutrals learned that indecision could look like defiance to both visitors. The map had not changed, but the country now contained two nations sharing the same roads. Guns and drums answered the breakdown in talks. By late 1642, both camps treated negotiation as delay, not solution, and moved men into the field. Commissions, ordinances, and city loans turned into powder, shot, boots, and bread. Country lanes filled with small columns carrying pikes that still smelled of fresh wood. Captains learned routes to barns that could serve as magazines. The government of England now traveled with carts, and authority began to look like whoever held a crossroads after dusk. Neither side started ready. The officers knew the language of honor better than the language of drill. Many had seen service abroad, but few had commanded English levies. Musters pulled in artisans, farm servants, apprentices, and yeomen who owned a musket, but not much else. Cavalrymen brought horses from their own stables, some fit for a tilt yard, others barely trained to stand under fire. Music and flags gave shape where training could not. Orders repeated 3 times tried to do the work of months of practice. The armies found each other on ridges near Edgehill in October. Scouts counted colors and guessed at numbers across open fields broken by hedges and folds in the ground. The King's Standard drew men to the center, while Parliament's commanders aligned lines to protect the road toward London. The morning passed in adjustments. Gun crews tested powder. Messengers carried notes along the fronts. When the guns opened, gaps appeared as companies shuffled to keep touch with their neighbors. No clear winner emerged. Success came in bursts and vanished in overreach. A wing might drive its opponent, then lose cohesion chasing fugitives. Infantry blocks held ground, traded volleys, and waited for help that did not arrive on time. The sun slid down, and smoke wrapped the fields. By nightfall, both camps kept possessions of parts of the field and found reasons to claim steadiness. Neither could deliver a final stroke, and neither dissolved. The result still stunned people. Englishmen had killed Englishmen in lines where parish met parish. Letters home carried lists of the wounded and the missing. Local gentry counted tenants who would not return to harvest. Church bells tolled for men whose captains had marched them only days before. The shock did not come from the size of the forces. It came from the intimacy of the losses and the realization that the quarrel had acquired a body count. Edgehill revealed limits. Leaders struggled to control pursuit, to time reserves, and to read a battlefield through powder haze. Drummers missed signals. Officers overused gallant charges and underused coordination. Logistics creaked under the strain as bread ran short and cartridges failed. The lesson spread quickly inside both camps. Bravery cannot fill a wagon or teach a recruit to stand fast after his first volley. After the battle, planning shifted. Parliament focused on keeping London secure, securing magazines, and systematizing pay. Royalists worked hard to hold the Midlands and gather credit for supply. Both sides began to build staff systems for musters, audits, and contracts. Recruiting changed tone from calls to honor to promises of clothing, food, and arrears schedules. The psychological turn was hard. Edgehill proved the conflict would not fold after a single show of arms. Families began to store grain against billeting. Neutral talk dried up. And many men who had marched out as militia went home that very night, their duty done in their eyes, leaving officers to discover how thin their ranks would be by morning. Edgehill taught both camps that courage without structure wastes lives, and Parliament acted first on that lesson. County bands could hold a town for a week, but they fell apart on a campaign. Arrears piled up, captains argued over precedents, and men slipped home after harvest. Royalist field armies, stiffened by veterans and strong cavalry, took advantage of that weakness through raids that unstitched Parliament's gains. Committees in London began to treat supply schedules and pay lists as weapons. If the war would be decided by who could keep men in ranks through winter, then administration mattered as much as valor. Out of this need stepped Oliver Cromwell. He started as a lesser gentry captain in the Eastern Association and made his reputation by drilling horse to hold formation after contact. He pushed troopers to ride knee to knee, fire at close range, and reform quickly rather than scatter in pursuit. He picked officers for steadiness, not pedigree, and removed those who drank, looted, or hesitated. His cavalry learned to trust orders delivered at speed and to look for the second charge rather than the first flourish. In a conflict of patchwork levies, that kind of consistency looked like an edge that could be multiplied. Parliament set out to multiply it. Fragmented county armies could not answer a mobile royal army that shifted weight from the north to the west and back again. The solution was a single national force built around pay, drill, and common command. Ordinances established central contracts for clothing and arms, musters for auditing numbers, and fixed rates for troopers and infantry. Sir Thomas Fairfax took command, while field officers coordinated recruitment by districts instead of by noble households. Units received standardized colors and equipment to help replacements slot into line without weeks of retraining. Discipline followed the money. Regular wages cut the temptation to plunder barns, and courts-martial punished theft and drunkenness. Chaplains worked alongside quartermasters. Sermons and fast days sat beside ration issues and shoe deliveries. Men enlisted with an understanding that arrears would be tracked and paid, and that complaints had channels above a captain's temper. Deserters faced pursuit, not shrugs. Training days emphasized coordinated volleys, timed charges, and the habit of reforming ranks under pressure. March routes linked magazines that committees kept stock by contract rather than by last-minute requisition. Belief did real work here. Many recruits saw the war as a defense of reformed religion and lawful government, and that conviction supported the discipline. Officers encouraged Bible reading and moral conduct, not as decoration, but as part of unit cohesion. A company that shared rules about drink, prayer, and punishment found it easier to stand when a neighbor broke. Sectarian differences existed, but the command structure set boundaries that kept disputes from dissolving companies. The language of a godly cause blended with the language of schedules and returns. By 1645, the new model army moved faster, held formation longer, and recovered quicker from setbacks than its opponents. It could concentrate force across counties because its pay chests and clothing contracts traveled with it. Royal commands still had skill and courage, but they struggled to replace losses and keep cavalry in hand after an initial success. The balance tilted. Parliament's machine began to press the King's field army whenever it stood. By early summer 1645, Parliament had an army that could move, fight, and recover in sequence. Pay chests, magazines, and a common command let units concentrate fast without leaving gaps behind. Sir Thomas Fairfax held the overall plan. Oliver Cromwell's horse and veteran infantry brigades gave the striking power. The King's main field army gathered to stop that advance and protect the central Midlands, a belt of road and supply that still linked royalist strongholds. They met near the village of Naseby on a June morning. Ground mattered. The ridges and open fields favored a force that could hold its shape under pressure. Parliament formed with infantry set in the center and cavalry anchored on the flanks, keeping reserves in hand rather than spending everything on the first push. Drums and standards kept time while officers checked intervals so files could wheel and support neighbors. Across the line, royalist troops showed confidence in their horse and hoped to crack a wing and roll up the rest. Every action went the King's way on one flank. Royalist cavalry charged hard, drove opponents back, and scattered pursuers across the rear. That success, though, created a familiar problem. Men galloped after broken foes and left their own infantry without cover. Parliament's troops, drilled to reform quickly, sealed the gap and held the center with steady volleys. Cromwell's wing, kept in tighter control, struck back in measured charges, then regrouped instead of chasing glory into the distance. The middle decided it. Parliament's foot pressed forward as musketeers fired in sequence and pikes kept shape against rushes. Officers walked the line and pulled up companies that wavered. Royalist coordination frayed as returning cavalry found no clear lane to re-enter the fight. Signals clashed, powder ran low in pockets, and the king's army began to fold from the center outward. Once the line lost coherence, Parliament's reserves moved in and turned a strain into a rout. Defeat at Naseby broke more than a battlefield formation. It shattered Charles I's capacity to wage large-scale war with confidence. He could still gather garrisons and fight actions, but the field army that protected strategy and movement was gone. Parliament now had freedom to reduce strong points and to dictate where the next blows would fall. That shift meant loans, taxes, and local committees could operate with less fear of sudden reversal. The aftermath added a second wound. Parliament's troops captured the king's baggage, including his private correspondence. Couriers and secretaries had guarded those chests because they contained the story behind the public declarations, contacts abroad, appeals for help, and plans to balance one faction against another. Once secured, the papers went to London. Editors prepared selections and pressed them as a window into royal policy that did not match speeches made to subjects. Those printed letters exposed efforts to win foreign and Irish Catholic support, and they reached a wide audience. Readers who might accept a king's right to seek allies now saw the details as a risk to Protestant security and to the promises made in negotiation. Trust, already fragile, took a hard hit. The military defeat and the publication combined to strip away claims that only rebels threatened the realm's safety. From that point, a royalist recovery required luck the war no longer offered. Parliament's army kept the initiative, and the king's cause struggled to rebuild both numbers and credibility. Naseby cracked the frame that held royalism together. Garrisons still flew the king's colors, but their relief never came. One by one, towns negotiated terms, surrendered magazines, and took paroles. Cavalry stripped away in small knots to avoid being counted and pressed into new fights. By early 1646, the king's field options narrowed to movement, not command. Oxford, the court's remaining hub, carried the weight of correspondence, coin, and symbols that no longer reached secure armies. In the spring, Charles I left Oxford in disguise and moved through a web of safe houses. He avoided parliamentary patrols and sidestepped royalist bands that might trap him in a lost cause. His choice was calculated: reach the Scottish army in the north, a force tied to Parliament by treaty but guided by its own kirk and estates. He believed the Scots could act as brokers, temper the English struggle over church and militia, and present a settlement that restored his authority with terms he could accept. The Scots received him, but they did not treat him as a guest free to depart. They held the king while they weighed their position and the promises he would make on religion and command. Their army sat inside England with supply needs and arrears. Negotiations ran on parallel tracks: how to end the war, who would control the militia, and which church settlement would bind three kingdoms that did not share one model of worship. Every clause touched a nerve back in Edinburgh, London, and the English counties feeding troops on both sides. With no army in the field and no seat of government, Charles lost the initiative. Messages left his quarters, but others now set the calendar. Committees in Westminster counted costs. The new model army prepared sieges and disbandment plans in the same breath. The Scots conferred with English commissioners about pay for their forces and terms for withdrawal. Meanwhile, county committees asked how to feed garrisons without provoking riots, and creditors pressed for assurance that the future government, whichever form it took, would honor notes and taxes already laid. Inside this grid, Charles kept to his method. He negotiated with each audience as if the talking itself created options. He tested concessions against the next meeting. He leaned on differences between Presbyterians and Independents, between army officers and civilian leaders, and between English priorities and Scottish fears. He offered church settlements bounded by time, floated shared control of the militia, and hinted at alliances that might balance rivals. The delays did not reset the board. They hardened the view among his opponents that he would never bind himself to a single settlement if a second path remained open. Parliament and the army argued over the endgame. Some MPs wanted a swift peace with strict church uniformity. Army grandees resisted any settlement that would disarm their influence or punish tender consciences. Petitions moved from regiments to Westminster and back again. Pay arrears and indemnity for wartime actions joined doctrine and militia control on the list of demands. In that climate, patience for royal delay thinned further, and moderates found less room to translate offers into enforceable terms. The king's captivity did not end his search for leverage. From guarded rooms, Charles I sent messages through trusted courtiers and foreign contacts, testing which alliance could return him to negotiating power. He used delay and ambiguity as tools, offering different terms to different audiences while avoiding clear commitments he could not later withdraw. The goal was simple: find force outside Westminster that could pressure his opponents back into a settlement on his terms, or at least fracture them enough to reopen options he had lost. Scotland became the hinge. Charles sounded out factions within the Scottish political nation, men who backed a Presbyterian church but worried about English dominance and the new model army's influence. He promised a national church settlement more aligned with their expectations and hinted at control over the militia as a shared trust. In return, he looked for troops and a campaign that would break the deadlock south of the border. Scottish leaders debated risk, finance, and how far their cause would be tied to a king who had resisted lasting concessions. In the end, enough support formed to move men and money. While those plans took shape, unrest flared across England and Wales. Royalist sympathizers in key towns tried to seize magazines, rally horse, and link pockets of resistance into a wider front. Local grievances gave these efforts traction. Arrears, garrison burdens, and resentment of new religious rules fed recruitment. Ships, fortifications, and bridges became targets, because whoever held them could tax movement and threaten supply. It did not look like 1642. It looked like a chain of fires that might join if the wind turned. Parliament and the army read this as a breach of faith. Negotiations had continued around church policy, indemnity, and disbandment, but secret contacts and uprisings undercut those talks. Officers who had spent years keeping men paid, fed, and disciplined saw a pattern rather than a misunderstanding. They asked for authority to act quickly, to march where the crisis burned hottest, and to hold captured leaders without waiting on slow committee processes. Political patience shrank alongside military tolerance. The Second Civil War ran shorter, but struck harder. Parliamentarian commanders moved fast, using interior lines to turn local risings into isolated defeats. Garrisons that had held out for months in the First War now faced concentrated force and a sharper tone. Field fights ended with less parley and more pursuit. When Scottish troops crossed into England to make good on promises, they met a coordinated answer, not a scattered defense. The new model's logistics, magazines, pay, and audits let it pivot from county to county while keeping pressure on the main threat. Decisive actions closed the ring. Parliament's forces cut supply corridors, rolled up detachments that had tried to link, and forced leaders to seek fragile refuge in ports and hills. Captured correspondents and prisoners confirmed what already many believed. Parallel deals and renewed arms were not bargaining chips, but a route back to the old uncertainty. Each success hardened views in barracks and in committee rooms. Proposals that spoke of conditional restoration began to sound unsafe to those who had just bled to stop a second wave. That conclusion shaped the next step. Victory convinced many officers and allies that no stable peace could hold while the king remained a rallying point. Moderates lost ground as petitions from regiments pressed for a settlement that removed the risk at its source. The monarchy's status shifted in debate from sacred office to potential threat. Some leaders said the lesson was clear: treating with the king only multiplied graves. The army's attention turned from battle to law, and from law to judgment. The victories of 1648 brought no agreement about what to do with a captive king. In Westminster, members argued over whether to continue drafting terms that would restore Charles I with tighter limits or halt talks altogether. Committees weighed church settlement, militia control, and indemnity for soldiers. Some MPs framed a restored monarchy as the safest path to peace and credit recovery. Others warned that fresh treaties would unwind on contact with reality. Outside the chamber, soldiers who had chased uprisings across counties read the debate as a return to the same stall that had preceded renewed bloodshed. Army leaders decided that waiting meant losing the peace they had won in the field. Petitions from regiments called for justice for those who sparked the Second Civil War and for protections from conscience and arrears. Officers discussed how to prevent a parliamentary vote that might invite the king back before the army's concerns were settled. Meetings in council chambers shifted from strategy against garrisons to strategy against vote count. The message moved down the ranks: guard London, watch Westminster, and make sure no decision undercuts the settlement the troops expected. In early December, the new model marched its argument to the doors. Guards posted pickets along approaches to the Palace of Westminster and set checkpoints at the entrances. The man in charge on the ground was Thomas Pride, an officer known for obedience to orders and a plain method. Soldiers carried lists with names of members marked as favoring reconciliation. Messengers warned allies inside that the House might not sit as usual, but the Commons gathered all the same, hoping to proceed before the army made its move. The move came fast. As MPs arrived, soldiers stopped them on the stairs and in the lobby. Those named on the lists faced three options: arrest, exclusion, or turning back under pressure. Some tried to argue their way in. Others stepped aside to avoid a scene that could spill into violence. The operation ran as a checkpoint, not a riot. Files of musketeers left little space for debate. Clerks and doorkeepers watched as colleagues were led away to custody in nearby buildings or told to go home. Hours later, benches sat half empty, and the balance inside the chamber had altered without a vote. By the day's end, Hundreds of elected representatives had been removed or deterred. The group that remained kept the legal shell of the Commons but represented a fraction of the membership. People soon called it the Rump Parliament. It claimed authority to sit and legislate, and it did pass acts and manage revenue. But the power behind its doors rested on army support. Officers advised committees, controlled access, and made it clear that soldiers would not allow a reversal of course toward royal restoration without safeguards the army trusted. The purge cleared the path, and the Commons that remained moved quickly. Committees drafted an ordinance to create a High Court of Justice, a body built for a single purpose: to try Charles Stuart for treason. The Lords would not consent, so the Rump acted alone and asserted that the people, represented in Parliament, held supreme authority. Clerks drew procedures, named commissioners to sit as judges, and arranged a courtroom inside Westminster Hall. Soldiers set sentries at doors and controlled access. The process looked like law, but everyone knew it stood on power asserted in December. The charge reached beyond lost battles. Prosecutors framed the case as a public wrong. The king had raised and maintained war against his subjects, against the peace of the realm, and against the laws he was sworn to uphold. They listed forts seized, garrisons supplied, and orders given after negotiations had begun. The indictment treated the crown not as a shield, but as the instrument of harm. That language mattered. It offered a way to place a monarch within rules that applied to others, and to test his actions against statutes, oaths, and the Commonwealth's safety. Charles entered under guard and refused the premise. He argued that no court formed by the Commons alone had jurisdiction to judge a king. He demanded to know by what authority they sat, and would not plead to a charge from a tribunal he did not accept. The commissioners, under instructions to proceed, recorded his refusals and ruled that silence would not halt the case. Witnesses spoke to movements of troops, signatures on warrants, and campaigns waged after talks. Clerks read depositions into the record while the defendants stood on principle and declined engagement. Outside the hall, arguments ran hot and uneven. Londoners gathered to see processions of lawyers and soldiers. Some voiced shock that a sacred office could be set on trial like any other defendant. Others, especially among army supporters and radical congregations, spoke of justice long delayed. Newsbooks reported each session, but few could claim to speak for the whole nation. In villages and market towns, people heard only fragments: that the king would not plead, that soldiers guarded the doors, that Parliament pressed on without the Lords. The courtroom ritual pressed toward a verdict even as its basis stayed contested. Commissioners called for order, recorded the king's interruptions, and affirmed that the law stood above any single person. The symbolism cut both ways. To supporters, it showed accountability. To critics, it showed force dressed in procedure. Either way, the proceeding altered the frame of debate. What had begun years earlier as disputes over taxation and bishops now sat as a test of whether office protected a man from judgment by his subjects. When judgment came, it carried more than a sentence. It declared that a ruler who had violated the trust of his people and levied war against them could be held answerable. That conclusion entered political thought, stayed there. It did not settle the country, but it taught a new grammar of sovereignty and consent. The sentence came first. In January 1649, after months of political maneuvering, a specially selected court declared Charles I guilty, and condemned him to die. The Rump Parliament had cleared the path by excluding opponents and asserting that the nation, through its representatives, could try a monarch. What followed broke a pattern that Europe had taken for granted. Kings might be overthrown, imprisoned, even murdered in secret, but not judged in public and executed by law. Security set the tone in London. Soldiers patrolled the streets and guarded key approaches to Whitehall. The army wanted no crowds swelling around the palace, no last-minute rescue, no riot that could turn the scaffold into a battleground. Shops along the route stayed shuttered. Windows overlooked by musketeers signaled that the military, not the city, held the day. The scaffold itself was a new structure, built outside the banqueting house. Workers raised it high enough for witnesses to see, yet enclosed it to keep the crush at a distance. A low rail and black drapes formed the space where the king would meet the axe. The symbolism was not subtle. The execution site sat before a hall known for royal ceremony and Stuart grandeur, now reduced to a backdrop for state punishment. Charles walked out wearing a thick shirt to prevent visible shivering. He spoke calmly and at length about lawful authority and conscience. He insisted that the crown rested on divine sanction and that he died for a principle, not for a faction. Those closest heard him claim the role of martyr for established monarchy. He forgave the executioner and asked that the signal be understood clearly. One stroke ended it. The axe fell cleanly, and the headsman held up the severed head. A groan rippled through the onlookers, some in shock, some in grim approval, and many simply stunned into silence. The act destroyed more than a life. It severed the visible link between the person of the king and the institution of kingship. The crown no longer anchored the Constitution. The army and Parliament had forced a new center of gravity. Courts abroad reacted quickly. Messengers carried the news to Paris, Madrid, The Hague, and Rome. Ministers wrote guarded letters. Queens and princes expressed horror in private and caution in public. If subjects could execute a crowned king in London, what protected thrones elsewhere from judges, soldiers, and committees? Diplomatic gestures slowed, and negotiations with England grew brittle and conditional. At home, the constitutional map redrew itself within days. The monarchy was declared abolished. The House of Lords, long a second chamber, vanished from the legislative process. England became a commonwealth governed by the rump and backed by the army's authority. State seals changed. Oaths were rewritten. Officials swore to a republic that had come into being by force of arms and acts of parliament rather than dynastic succession. The axe cleared the throne, and a new label appeared on official seals: the Commonwealth of England. Parliament declared the kingdom a free state, and the Crown and the House of Lords were officially abolished. Authority, on paper, now flowed through the people's representatives gathered in the Rump Parliament. The state reorganized its ceremonies, rewrote oaths, and issued commissions in the name of the Republic. Councils replaced royal household offices. Courts continued sitting, but they acted under statutes that avoided any mention of a monarch. The promise that ran through every ordinance? Reform, stability, and a moral reset after years of campaign and contribution. In the chambers at Westminster, members claimed legislative supremacy, but the army stood behind them with cash, muskets, and the habit of command. Soldiers received regular pay through new tax assessments and confiscations. The Council of State coordinated foreign and domestic policy, while army grandees held the leverage to push or stall decisions. The Commonwealth carried the weight of two calendars at once: civil government by parliamentary vote and military necessity by order of officers who had learned speed and discipline in the field. That dual clock set the tempo of early Republican rule. Diplomacy turned awkward. Most crowned heads withheld recognition, and ambassadors calibrated their manners carefully. English agents negotiated trade and sea rights while avoiding titles that implied royal continuity. Merchant convoys sailed with letters of protection from a government many ports would not name aloud. The Navy grew into the regime's best messenger abroad, escorting commerce and signaling that England intended to act like a state whether or not courts on the continent approved. For all that, official correspondence often stalled, and treaties dragged. At home, disagreements surfaced quickly. Some wanted a broad franchise and frequent elections. Others feared that rapid rotation would break fragile order. Religious policy caused arguments in pulpits and council rooms. Toleration for Protestant groups expanded in some places, while local magistrates enforced narrow norms in others. Parish life still centered on poor relief, tithes, and church wardens' accounts. But the question of who set the terms, Parliament, county committees, or ministers with gathered congregations, never quite settled. Print shops poured out proposals, many of them practical, some visionary. The Army's presence shaped daily administration. County garrisons watched roads, collected taxes, and enforced ordinances against disorder. That steadied markets in a few towns, but bred resentment in others. Farmers still bargained over rents and tithes. Guilds still admitted apprentices. Prices moved with harvests rather than speeches. For many households, the grand experiment did not change the cost of bread, the length of the workday, or the ease of finding credit. Revolutionary language sat beside ordinary routines. Financial strain pressed every policy. The regime needed revenue for salaries, fortresses, and ships. Confiscated estates and sales of crown lands offset debt, but not enough to relax the tax burden. Committees audited accounts and chased arrears. Reform bills promised a cleaner legal code and fairer courts. Yet those same bills often ran into the wall of enforcement. The Commonwealth struggled to keep its Republican ideals in view while asserting enough central control to prevent drift. Its leaders knew that elections without order invite instability, but order without consent starts to look like conquest. The Commonwealth did not pause after abolishing the crown. Its leaders turned to the unresolved fronts across the Irish Sea and north of the border. The concern was simple. If England's new regime looked fragile, exiled royalists and foreign powers could use Ireland or Scotland as launch points. Securing those kingdoms became a test of the Republic's credibility. The hand fell to soldiers who had learned hard lessons in the civil wars and now applied them to a wider map. Oliver Cromwell took the expeditionary force to Ireland with orders to break resistance and close the door to outside aid. Garrison towns along the east coast became entry points for the army and its supplies. Siege trains, field artillery, and strict marching schedules signaled a professional approach. Local commanders demanded surrenders on terms that discouraged future revolts. When towns resisted, assaults followed, and the treatment of captured soldiers and inhabitants served as warnings to others still holding out. The policy aimed at speed as much as punishment, reducing the number of prolonged sieges that could drain men and money. Once major strongholds fell, policy shifted from immediate force to long-term control. Parliament approved large-scale land seizures to pay soldiers and settle debts. Surveys mapped estates in detail, and commissioners assigned confiscated tracts to investors, veterans, and officials. This redistribution reordered authority in the countryside, moving power from long-standing proprietors to men tied to the new regime. Parish boundaries stayed, but who collected rents, appointed agents, and directed legal suits changed. Laws on religion and public worship also moved in step with the new ownership structure, embedding loyalty to the Commonwealth in local administration. North of the border, the issue took a different shape. Scotland rallied around Charles II, the late king's son, combining royal allegiance with a national cause. The Commonwealth's response relied on field armies that had adapted to swift campaigning. River crossings, fortified lines, and supply depots determined the pace. Battles and forced marches chipped away at Scottish strength. Once key armies broke, garrisons secured ports, burghs, and roads, tightening control and limiting the ability of exiled leaders to return with allies. Resistance did not end overnight, but organized opposition could no longer challenge the Republic in the open field. By 1651, the military map looked different from any point in earlier Stuart rule. England, Ireland, and Scotland lay under coordinated command, with regional governors and councils reporting through military channels. Roads carried couriers instead of banners. Local courts continued, yet their orders depended on the presence of troops and the willingness of officers to back warrants. Customs posts collected revenue for a central treasury. The Republic's navy protected trade lanes and blocked hostile landings, linking domestic security to sea power in a way older regimes had struggled to achieve. These campaigns kept hostile coalitions at bay and gave the Commonwealth time to legislate at home. They also seeded bitterness that lasted well beyond the 1650s. Families displaced by confiscations, clergy removed from livings, and towns reduced by siege found little comfort in promises of reform from London. The Republic survived because it held ground, manned forts, and met payrolls. It paid a price in resentment that outlived the soldiers who enforced its writ. By 1653, the project of ruling through the rump had stalled. Taxation, military commitments, and stalled reform bills convinced senior officers that the machine could not run on votes alone. Oliver Cromwell, carrying the authority of recent victories and the confidence of the army, walked into Westminster and dissolved the assembly by force. The experiment in parliamentary republicanism ended with doors closed, records seized, and members told to leave. Authority shifted from a fractious legislature to the men who had won the wars and kept the garrisons paid. What followed needed legal shape. A written framework known as the Instrument of Government set up a protectorate with Cromwell as head of state. Councils replaced ad hoc committees. A single-chamber parliament would sit on a set schedule, and a council of state would handle daily business. The documents set revenue streams for the Navy, the Army, and civil administration, and fixed elections by defined constituencies. It read like a checklist for stability: time limits, budget lines, and an executive with enough power to keep policy moving. Titles changed, but power felt familiar. England was not a monarchy, yet the Lord Protector signed treaties, appointed officials, and commanded forces. He had a formal residence, a guard, and a court-like household. He could not create peers or pass the crown, but he held a veto for a limited window and could call and dissolve parliaments under the Constitution's rules. The difference lay on paper. The resemblance lay in daily practice. Visitors found a controlled center, layers of access, and a ruler balancing factions. The army remained the backbone. Major general governors, colonels, and trusted officers administered regions, supervised militia reforms, and enforced security laws. They identified suspected conspirators, licensed public meetings, and watched road traffic. That brought order in counties long used to weak sheriffs and contested juries. It also gave critics an easy phrase: government by sword. Civil courts still sat, but their writ was firmest where a garrison stood nearby and pay chests arrived on time. Religious policy stretched wider than earlier regimes allowed. Many Protestant groups worshipped with less fear of prosecution, and preachers used licensed pulpits to build congregations outside the old parish system. Yet limits stayed firm. Catholics faced legal pressure and fines. Certain radical movements drew surveillance or suppression when they challenged property, public order, or the authority of ministers. Tolerance worked as a hedge against sectarian conflict, not a blank check for every doctrine. Cromwell tried to blend reform with restraint. Committees pushed legal codification, pursued moral regulation, and debated electoral adjustments. Trade policy linked customs to naval strength and colonial ventures. London's docks, the navy yards, and coinage policy became the regime's steady beats. But each advance stirred resistance. Country gentlemen disliked central oversight. Merchants wanted predictability without inspection. Parish elites resented outside visitors who questioned how they handled tithes and poor relief. By the mid-1650s, the Protectorate delivered security many had missed since the 1630s. Assize circuits functioned, harvests moved to market, and the Navy guarded sea lanes. Yet no settlement stuck. Parliaments argued over the basis of authority. Officers defended their role as necessity, not ambition. In 1657, Allies tested how far the Constitution could bend by offering Cromwell the crown. He declined, judging the word king too costly to the fragile coalition that kept the regime upright. Stability held for now, but it relied on careful balances between soldier and civilian, preacher and magistrate, center and county, balances that shifted whenever pay fell late or a bill met resistance in the chamber. Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658 exposed a weakness that the written constitutions could not solve. The Protectorate had rules about councils, parliaments, and taxation, but it had no settled way to transfer authority when the central figure disappeared. The council named his son, Richard Cromwell, as Lord Protector. On paper, the process looked orderly. In practice, everything depended on whether soldiers, office holders, and creditors believed the new leader could hold the system together. Richard lacked the army reputation that kept his father's government steady. He had never commanded in the field or built relationships with the officers who ran garrisons and musters. Senior figures in the army measured him against the demands of pay, discipline, and political judgment and found him untested. At the same time, county elites hoped for a calmer style, fewer military interventions, and regular parliamentary sessions. Those two expectations pulled in different directions, and Richard tried to satisfy both without a power base of his own. Parliament returned with grievances that had built up over years of central control. Members questioned army budgets, the reach of military justice, and the legality of earlier dissolutions. They pressed for civilian oversight of finance and for limits on officers who acted as regional administrators. The army, in turn, warned that unpaid troops and unresolved security threats made fast decisions essential. Arguments moved from committees to corridors to barracks. The uneasy truce between soldier and civilian that had marked the Protectorate began to slip. Money sharpened the dispute. War debts, naval costs, and garrison wages still demanded revenue. Tax farmers, excise collectors, and county treasurers felt pressure from all sides. When Parliament probed accounts and delayed appropriations, officers read it as a challenge to their survival. Some units signaled loyalty to Richard if he defended their interests. Others withheld support and waited for stronger leadership. Factions formed around older generals, civilian councilors, and city financiers who wanted their loans repaid before any new scheme took shape. By early 1659, the framework of government lurched from one arrangement to another. Parliaments were summoned, criticized, and sidelined. Councils issued ordinances that lacked broad consent. Army committees reinstated figures that previous sessions had excluded, then reversed the course under pressure. Counties saw orders change with little warning. The result was a string of short-lived combinations, each promising a settlement and each dissolved by the next quarrel over pay, privilege, or precedence. Public patience thinned. Merchants wanted clear rules for customs and insurance. Landowners sought predictability in rents and tithes. Parish officers needed guidance on poor relief. Instead, they met shifting directives and the sense that no one could commit to a plan for longer than a season. Pamphlets complained about experiments that never ended. Coffeehouses traded rumors of plots and restorations, while markets adjusted to uncertainty through higher risk costs and tighter credit. When the army finally moved against Richard's position, it did so with the language of necessity, not rebellion. He had few levers to pull and fewer allies to defend him. Without command over troops or a loyal bloc in Parliament, he stepped aside. The system that had depended on a single, dominant figure no longer had one. The last months of 1659 showed the limits of governing by shifting coalitions and military guardianship. Deadlock in 1659 had left committees arguing while soldiers shuffled governments in and out of power. By early 1660, county gentry, merchants, and wary officers wanted salaries paid, courts open, and a clear chain of command. Many concluded that a single recognized executive could deliver what rotating councils could not. Negotiations picked up pace in London and in army headquarters, and the question narrowed from whether to restore a king to how to do it without reopening war. The answer required a public offer that could reassure creditors, protect property, and calm those who had fought on the other side. Members of Parliament opened a channel to Charles Stuart, living in exile. They sought assurances that would protect existing land titles, prevent purges, and quiet fears of religious persecution. In April, Charles issued the Declaration of Breda. It promised a general pardon subject to lawful exceptions, a settlement of property disputes through Parliament, and measured religious indulgence within the framework of law. The pledge did not solve every dispute, but it gave moderates a text they could defend in debates and a basis to argue that restoration meant peace rather than retaliation. The move from promise to arrival happened quickly. Fleet commanders and key garrisons accepted the settlement. City leaders prepared addresses, and printers rushed loyal addresses into print. When Charles landed and traveled to London, the process stayed orderly. No pitched battles, no counter coups, and no mass arrests marked the route. Crowds gathered, but the tone reflected relief after years of uncertainty. Magistrates coordinated ceremonies while ensuring that shops reopened and carriers moved along their routes. The practical business of government restarted with clear lines of authority. Institutional repair followed. The monarchy returned with its councils and seals. The House of Lords resumed as a legislative chamber, and bishops returned to the Church of England. Courts adjusted to new oaths, and royal warrants replaced committees for routine business. The structure looked familiar, but the memory of the 1640s and 1650s shaped how people acted inside it. Ministers mindful of past standoffs consulted more broadly. Judges weighed statutes passed in the interregnum when hearing disputes over contracts and titles, showing that the legal system would not pretend a decade of governance had never happened. Charles II handled politics with a lighter touch than his father. He worked with Parliament to secure revenue and confirm settlements, and he delegated to advisors who could negotiate with city financiers and country interests. He showed care when filling offices, often retaining capable men who had served under previous regimes. Many former parliamentarians kept positions in local government, which limited cycles of revenge and kept county administration stable. The message was practical: keep the peace, collect the taxes, and let commerce run. The Restoration did not erase every change made since 1642. Centralized taxation, a stronger navy, and a more professional approach to administration carried over. Religious uniformity returned in law, but enforcement moved at the speed of local realities. The settlement prioritized order, cash flow, and predictable rules, aiming to make politics less dangerous for most people most of the time. Here's a fun fact. During his years on the run, Charles hid in an oak tree to evade pursuers, a story that later fed royal symbols and celebrations tied to his return. The settlement after 1660 did not restore the old order. It set different boundaries. The crown returned with councils and courts, but taxation and lawmaking ran through Parliament as routine, not as favors granted case by case. Ministers needed grants voted in public sessions. Revenue streams, like customs and excise, received statutory backing that required regular consent. That habit anchored a rule. Major policy needed parliamentary approval. Disputes still flared, yet they unfolded within a framework that assumed bargaining between Crown and Commons rather than decrees backed by personal authority. Legal thinking also shifted. The Civil Wars made the phrase rule of law more than rhetoric by bringing statutes and precedents to the center of argument. Courts tested whether orders matched enacted law. Officials kept records that could be scrutinized later, and oaths tied to service to the law of the realm rather than to a single person. When governments changed, judges weighed continuity by asking which acts had legal force, not which faction held the fortress. That mindset fostered a culture where rulers answered to defined rules and where legal remedies, writs, appeals, parliamentary petitions, became normal tools of politics. Parliament's role grew into the main axis of national policy. Debates over war finance, trade charters, and colonial ventures passed through committees before they reached the floor. The Commons shaped supply, audited accounts, and demanded reports from officers and commissioners. The Lords returned, but the center of political heat sat in the elected chamber. Even monarchs who pushed hard learned to build coalitions, manage party groupings, and work through managers who could count votes. Political careers formed around this calendar of sessions, elections, and inquiries. Control of armed force adjusted as a lesson from the 1640s. Standing troops existed, but they fell under civilian votes for money and statutes that defined their purpose. Annual measures authorized forces at home and at sea. Commanders reported to ministers, and ministers faced questions in Parliament. This kept military power visible and confined to tasks that legislators would fund. Garrisons guarded forts and yards, not polling places. The army had ranks and training, but its authority drew from budget lines agreed in public. Religion did not return to a single pattern. The Church of England resumed a privileged place, yet enforcement met a varied landscape. Dissenters organized chapels, published sermons, and lobbied for space to worship. Statutes set limits, but magistrates often looked for order rather than uniform belief. That created a practical tolerance in many towns. Clergy answered to bishops and law courts, while lay people navigated choices that widened over the decades. Debate moved from the pulpit to print, where argument could travel farther than a parish boundary. These changes fed later developments. Constitutional monarchy took shape as a working arrangement, a crowned executive, a responsible ministry, and a parliament that held the purse. Representative government evolved through contested elections, petitioning, and a press that reported sessions and scandals. Britain's influence abroad grew through this balance, stable enough to borrow and build fleets, flexible enough to adjust taxes and policy without regular breakdowns. The English Civil War wasn't just a fight for the crown. It reshaped power, government, and the idea that even kings could be held accountable. Its legacy still defines how Britain is ruled today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Britain's Game of Thrones, make sure to subscribe for more history where power, betrayal, and real consequences collide.